if you tuned into the first couple sessions, you saw that in session one, Markham introduced a simple model for talking about the energy transition, sort of trying to cut through the clutter to talk about this idea of disruption and adoption curves from a technological and a business perspective, which is something that probably doesn't come up enough in climate change education. And then in the second session, we talked about the different roles that business and government play. And in this very polarized all or nothing, this side versus that side world, it's nice to see a reminder that the middle part of a Venn diagram is where we spend most of our time, and that very much is the case with the energy transition and climate change. And then with this third session, we're going to be looking at how our current needs fit into the transition. So needless to say, major parts of North America and Canada and the US still rely heavily on fossil fuels. We rely on oil, natural gas, and coal, particularly in certain regions in central and western Canada. And one of the central questions of this webinar will be, what role do these fossil fuels have, if any, in the energy transition? And ultimately, we're all in agreement that combustion of fossil fuels is problematic because of the laws of physics and the warming that comes from that. But perhaps there are other ways around this, and Markham is going to take us into that in this session. I am located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. This is all Williams Treaty territory, also known as sort of southeastern central Ontario, or an hour and a half east of Toronto, which some people appreciate and some people not so much, depending on where you stand with Toronto. I like it. I used to live there for a few years. Webinar partners who've been doing a great job of getting the word out about these events. This is a listing of our webinar partners in Canada. You will see a couple familiar organizations. Perhaps you heard about this from one of these organizations. And then many partners in the United States. Most of those are NAAE affiliates from the North American Association of Environmental Education. And we thank them very much for spreading the good word about these very important topics. Obviously, we've just come off of COP26, and there was some progress. Hopefully people put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. Obviously, there was a bit of a compromise on coal. So that is certainly the context that we present this in. So most of today's session will consist of a presentation and case study that Markham will present, and I will formally introduce Markham in just a moment here. We then will be able to engage in a discussion, and because we have a small group here live, we can just unmute our videos or unmute our sounds, turn our videos on, and really talk in real time about any pressing questions that you have. And you can even throw anything right now in the chat box of pressing questions that you would really like to know about the energy transition and the role of fossil fuels as we transition. We'll then do a resource share from our three partner organizations, Green Teacher, whom I am representing, the Alberta Council for Environmental Education, or ACE, that Kathy is representing, and Green Learning, that Sydney is representing. And then we can wrap that up with a final discussion. All of this will take approximately an hour. We might go a little bit over time if we get into a particularly rich discussion, but we will not keep you too long. And last but not least in my introduction is our presenter, Markham Hislop. He's been a good sport, presenting, this is now his third in a 5-week period. So he has answered the bell and dug into some really challenging questions about this important topic that we know we need to be teaching about, and we're making up for lost time in a lot of ways. I've really been enjoying Markham's video interviews, several of which pop up each day on his YouTube channel with Energy Media, and you can see a lot of other resources on the Energy Media website. He's one of North America's leading climate and energy journalists. We're very pleased to have him back with us here for session 3 of this 3-part series. I am now going to take my post as the slide transferer, and I will pass the digital baton to Markham.
Well, thanks, Ian. I really appreciate your kind words. Believe me, I spend a lot of time on social media where I'm not always treated with the same respect.
On social media, I would never have guessed.
Yes, it's the interesting is I get it from both sides. From so we're going to talk about today is there room for oil and gas in the energy transition? So if we can get to the next slide, Ian. You referenced this polarized narrative we talked about a little bit in the last webinar. Have a polarized narrative, and in this case, it's phase out fossil fuels immediately versus fossil fuels support jobs, families, and the economy. And so, in Canada, where we see this play out is the province that I'm in, British Columbia, is very green. It's the home of Greenpeace, and there are plenty of people here, believe me, who would like to see fossil fuels phased out very quickly. And right next door in Alberta, the Texas of Canada, with lots of oil and gas and the home of the oil sands, then you see people's livelihoods are tied up in this. And it's not surprising that they want to defend their livelihoods, the way they pay the mortgage and feed their families. And it very often, we don't look for the middle ground. And some of what I'm going to be talking about again today is the middle ground, especially around oil and gas, because there could be, it's not guaranteed, but there could be a future for some oil and some gas in a low carbon future. So Ian, the next slide, please. And I was thinking about a framework to explain this, because in the first webinar, we had that simple little model, the 3-part model, where the first 20 or 30 years are very slow growth, and then you have the decade of disruption, the really rapid change which happens to be the 2020s, and then you have a period of slower growth as the new technologies become mature and push out the old. And so the frame that I came up with was this, and it's very common in amongst economists and net zero organizations, is decarbonization pathways. And I like this because if you look at North America, every jurisdiction has a different energy system, and they have different requirements, different cultures, different problems, different challenges, and they're all probably decarbonize it, sometimes in very different ways, and sometimes in similar ways, but it's all different. And so if you think of a decarbonization pathway as working backward from net zero by 2050 goal and developing strategies to achieve that goal, is basically choices. How long are you going to promote the electrification of transportation? British Columbia does, Quebec does in Canada, California does, Texas does, and Alberta doesn't. Are you going to decarbonize your power sector? Well, in British Columbia, you have 97% hydro. In Alberta, you have still 40% coal. So there are all of these kinds of choices that we're in the process of making. Some jurisdictions are more advanced in them. So California would be one, probably the most advanced in North America. And when economists talk about these decarbonization pathways, they talk about 4 sectors that need to be decarbonized. So you've got the power, the electricity system, you've got transportation, buildings, and industry. And fossil fuels play different roles in all of those. And as I've mentioned, every country or region has different challenges, and many tonight. So I wanted to use one of those sectors to kind of illustrate the decarbonization pathway options that are available to various regions. So we're going to talk about the electricity system and what role will coal and natural gas play as province and state decarbonize those systems. And we'll use 2 examples, BC and Alberta from Canada, and Texas and California from the United States. So if you look at British Columbia, it is 97% hydro. And it's also building another big hydro dam, the Site C. And even though it's very controversial, it'll bring a fair amount of power, additional electricity to the province. Now, what's interesting here is that I think there's agreement among policymakers and economists and so on that the most efficient way to decarbonize is to electrify. So we're going to move to electric cars and heat pumps in our homes, and we're going to what are some other examples? Probably not industry so much, but and we'll adopt renewables on a large scale because of the cost. So the challenge that British Columbia has is that economic modelers think that advanced economies like Canada and the US by 2050 will need 2 to 3 times as much electricity as they currently consume. Well, British Columbia, I think, I can't remember its consumption, but it gets its electricity from 34 hydro dams, and they simply can't build another 34 hydro dams. They won't even be building one after Site C. So they can expand some of them a little bit, but where is all that electricity going to come from? Well, if it's going to come from wind and solar, then that's a problem, because BC has average to below average wind and solar resources, and there's a limit to how much it's going to get. So as it looks forward to the future and picks its decarbonization pathways, it's grappling with this issue of not do I have to use coal or natural gas, but how will I use renewables that I don't have access to or we don't have good resources for. Now they could over in Alberta have a very different situation. You've got Alberta used the most coal out of any province up until not that long ago, and it's now down to 40%. And the federal government has mandated that by 2035, Canada will have a carbon-free electricity system. So, they're very quickly building out renewables, and the utilities are switching from coal to natural gas. And probably by 2030-ish, but certainly by 2035, what you'll see is an electricity system that has probably 30 or 40%, maybe higher renewables. But then where's it going to get the rest of that clean electricity from? Well, probably it might come from natural gas with carbon capture attached to it. That's a technology that Alberta is embracing. In fact, Alberta leads the world in carbon capture and storage, because Shell, for instance, has a huge refinery, and they did a $2 billion, I think it was, or $1.5 billion carbon capture. And Shell has used that as a learning experience, developed the technology, has expertise now, and other companies in the province have expertise. In fact, Delta Cleantech, I just interviewed the chairman not that long ago, Lionel Cambeats, and they just secured a $400 million contract to take their carbon capture technology over to China. They're going to be working in cement, natural gas, and coal in 3 projects. So this is something that we may see around natural gas, as it plays has a longer life in Canada, in provinces like Alberta, thanks to carbon capture. And it helps in Alberta that they've got the geology where they can actually store carbon underground. And there's already work begun on some infrastructure. They already have a CO2 pipeline. I think it's called the carbon trunk line. And they're going to be building more. And they also have policy and regulations around storing CO2 underground. You don't get to just poke a hole in the ground into an old oil and gas reservoir, or hook up to an old well and pump your CO2 down there. It's got to be regulated, and you have to receive permission, and you have to make sure that there's no leakage from that reservoir. So Alberta is unlike BC. It has the means to incorporate large-scale renewables, because it's more of an American-style market-based system instead of a big utility, a monopoly utility like BC Hydro and BC. But it's not clear that they will get off and be 100% clean electricity going forward, like past 2030. We're not quite sure yet how that's going to play out. Now, and interestingly, there's a lot of synergies that could be created between BC and Alberta. because one of the things that you can do with a hydro dam is use it to store electricity. Basically, you store electricity when wind and solar, when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And when it's not, then you basically stop your generators or you slow them down, and then you build water up in your reservoir. Then you can release it when you need it. But BC and Alberta don't talk to each other. They have a small amount of trade and some interties in their power grid, but they generally don't talk to each other and don't want to do any more than that. There's political animosity amongst the governments, and that's something that Canada has to sort out. Now go down to Texas and California, because California is more like BC and Texas is more like Alberta. California, of course, leads the world in attempting to decarbonize its power grid. But here's I looked up the stats just before we started. California gets 21% of its power, its electricity, from renewables. Well, guess what the percentage is for Texas? 21%. George W. Bush brought in, I think it was in the 90s, when he was governor of Texas, brought in renewable power portfolios, and you can go all up and down West Texas, and it's got quite a bit of wind. And so Texas actually has quite the same amount of renewables as California, and they also burn about the same amount of gas. Texas is 47%, and California, I think, is 43%. So the getting off natural gas in their electricity systems has been really, really tough. And California has been able to get most of its coal. I think it's just 5 or 6% of its electricity comes from coal, but that's not true in Texas. I think it's still about 20% because they used a lot of coal originally. And so they're making policy decisions, and they're trying to figure out, if you want to go to more renewables, you need more storage. Well, what kind of storage is that? California has been buying batteries, but batteries only have an 8-hour storage. What if you need storage for 3 days or a week? So now they're looking at other, like hydro store, pumping compressed air underground. That's a technology where you can store energy. And the technology has not been perfected yet to have 100% renewable power grid to deal with the intermittency. And I think, if I remember correctly, the last number I saw is that economists and engineers think that maybe you could get up to 30 or 40% renewables the way we are now, and still have a reliable, cost-effective grid. So, looking forward, Texas and California have also got these challenges. California has a very active government. Excuse me. They're bringing in zero emission vehicle mandates, both for passenger cars and trucks, and heavy duty and medium duty as well. And that's a big part of it's part of their policy strategy. Texas has got to roughly the same place and the current government, or the Texas government, for a long time hasn't been activist in this. They basically allowed cheap natural gas prices to displace coal. And in fact, the Texas government fought hard against the President Obama's Clean Power Plan. So this shows you some of the complexities that go into answering the question about where will coal and natural gas fit into electricity systems over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. Not only is it complex, we don't know what the end game will be. We know we want to have clean electricity systems, but ultimately what that will look like and all the technologies that will come into play, that we don't know yet. And so governments and companies and so on are working hard to figure that out. Next slide, please, Ian. So here's my personal take on where fossil fuels are going to go. So Canada is going to phase that out by 2035. Now, President Biden says that he's committed to a clean, carbon-free power grid, national power grid by 2035 as well. But the politics around that are much different. And it's not clear yet that he's going to be able to deliver. So, for instance, all of the promise he wasn't able to deliver on the Build Back Better Act and in the Infrastructure Act. He had to compromise quite a bit, and I think that shows the difficulty that he may have in terms of hitting that time frame. But I think ultimately, coal is on its way out. So oil. Now, this is an interesting one because peak oil demand, I interviewed Olivier Lejeune, who's an oil analyst for the International Energy Agency back in March. And he said, oil consumption is going to peak in the late 20s or the early 30s. And it's going to peak at around 104, 105 million barrels a day. It's roughly around 100, 101 right now. And then we'll see it start to decline over time. And the question is, what will the decline curve look like? Will it be a nice, big, soft shoulder so that the decline is slow over time? Or will it be a much steeper curve where we have the decline in a very short period of time? And a lot of that has to do with how fast we electrify transportation. And I just interviewed an analyst from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They're kind of the gold standard for electric vehicle sales. And they had produced a fact book for COP26 on electric vehicles. And they said in there, in just 2 years, since 2019, all forecasting agencies, including themselves, had added tens of millions of EV units to their forecasts. In fact, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, they added 200 million, from 700 to 900 million by 2040, because the industry is being disrupted and is changing over from gasoline and diesel to electric far faster than anybody imagined. And they expect that 2023, they'll look back on 2021 and they'll have to raise their forecasts again. And every time they raise their forecast, they're always conservative. And then they have to raise them again. So my personal take on this is that we're going to see peak oil demand maybe before 2030, maybe even as early as 2025, 2026. And the decline rate is going to be steeper than we anticipate. And of course, that has all sorts of implications. If you're in Texas or Alberta, or even if you're in California, which produces 500 barrels of oil a day, you're keeping a close eye on this because it has a lot to do with investment decisions, where you're going to put your capital and so on. So there's a very good chance that the net zero by 2050 IEA scenario, which shows oil consumption in 2050 at 25 million barrels a day, we might not get down that low, but I think it's going to be maybe between 20 and 50 billion barrels a day, maybe roughly half of what we consume now. So that's a big decline for an energy system and economies that are addicted to oil. Natural gas, it'll have the longest life of all the fossil fuels. It emits half the CO2 as coal, and it's cleaner than oil. And a lot of countries, and agencies like the IEA are looking at it as a transition or bridge fuel. And so it'll be around. And plus, petrochemicals very often use natural gas as a feedstock. So coal will be done much quicker. I wouldn't be surprised if 2060, 2070, you see the end of coal. Peak oil demand oil will probably be half of what we use by 2050, maybe even less. And natural gas, we could be using it to heat and maybe as a feedstock for materials after 2100. That's kind of the way things are playing out. But there's another question to be answered. Is there a post-combustion future for oil and gas? Can you make stuff out of hydrocarbons instead of burning it? And this is a very interesting question, and it gets back to that narrative that, we talked about the polarized narrative, phase it out or, defend it. But can you actually do something different with it? And the best example of this, and I'm a big proponent of the bitumen beyond combustion program at the Alberta agency. It's called Alberta Innovates. And they began this program in 2018 to see if they could come up with a process to turn oil sands bitumen, which is thick peanut butter. It's like it has the consistency of peanut butter, but it's very, very rich in carbon, and turn it into carbon fiber. Because if the analysis that was done showed that if you could make carbon fiber for about half the cost of what it is now, the automotive industry, which is looking to lighten up electric vehicles, would be a huge market for it. And then there's all sorts of other applications, like putting it in cement instead of steel rebar, that sort of thing. So I just interviewed Paulo Bomben, who's an engineer managing this program, and I interviewed him last week. And they have done a couple of these X challenges, where they give money to engineering teams, science teams to come up with different competing processes. And they're on phase 2 of their carbon fiber challenge. And they think by 2023, they will have a process that will be either ready to license to commercial manufacturers, or they'll be ready to set up a pilot, and then the next stage after that would be commercialization. So there is a very, very good chance that there will be a means by which Alberta bitumen, instead of using it as feedstock to make fuel, you'll use it as feedstock to make materials. And another material that it makes is asphalt binder. So, you still have to repair roads and build roads and all of that. And this makes the best asphalt binder. The problem, they're having trouble transporting it long distances. That's the problem. You have to keep it a little bit hot. So they're working on that technology. But this is an example where the gasoline, the oil that is made with that refined out of, let me put this, oil sands heavy crude oil that comes from this bitumen is among the most carbon intense in the world. It averages 70 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel. And they're only, I think it's fourth dirtiest in the world. We shouldn't be burning this stuff. It's the absolute worst stuff to burn. But if the oil sands can decarbonize, that is, it can get the emissions that are created during production down to zero, and then you can take the bitumen and make a material out of it. It's one of the biggest reserves in the world, and we could have almost endless supply of cheap carbon fiber to basically revolutionize how we build cars and build other structures that require lightweight and high strength. So that's one opportunity for post-combustion future. And then there's another one, and this, Alberta doesn't have an example or a lock on this, but I'll use it as an example. So they have a hydrogen strategy now that's fairly recent. And it turns out you can take natural gas and you can put it through a steam methane reformer and turn it into blue hydrogen. So that means that you have to capture the CO2 that's emitted during that process and then store it underground. But it's not perfect. There's still maybe 10 or 20% of the emissions that get out into the atmosphere. But it's much better than the gray hydrogen, which is created in industrial processes, and that's very, very dirty. And the advantage of blue hydrogen is it's very cheap. I think it's down around $3 or $4 a kilogram. And so jurisdictions like Alberta are saying, look, we're going to build our hydrogen, we're going to build these big hydrogen hubs, and we're going to start with blue hydrogen. And then down the road, as renewable energy gets cheaper and cheaper, maybe it gets to 2 cents a kilowatt hour, or maybe 1 or 1.5 cents, and electrolyzers, which are the technology that takes electricity and water and turns out green hydrogen, so where there's no emissions at all associated with that. When that becomes economic, then we'll gradually switch over to green hydrogen. And they're even looking at using hydrogen, creating hydrogen with cheap solar, pumping it underground into big salt caverns. And then when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, they can take that hydrogen and put it into their natural gas plants that they currently have, because with just a little bit of modification, those plants can then burn hydrogen instead of natural gas. Now that actually seems like a really smart idea, and one that is technically feasible. We have all the technology right now to do that, and so they're looking at that. And I interviewed an economist from the University of Calgary that had done a paper on it, and it just really looks feasible. Now that's relevant because in California, high deal Los Angeles has kind of the same idea. California gets, I think I said, what, 40%, around 40% of its electricity from natural gas. So, but it has a tremendous amount. It has more solar than any place else in the United States, and it creates so much solar electricity that it basically is worth nothing. And during the summer, when the resource is at its best, they actually have to curtail a lot of it. I mean, it's just wasted. And so this group has come together. It's got the California government, it's got the city of Los Angeles, it's got some big heavy industrial players like, I think it's Mitsubishi or Marubeni. It's even got Fortis BC, because Fortis BC has some relevant pipeline expertise. And the idea is to build this hub, kind of like Alberta will do, learn how to do green hydrogen really cheap, and then start switching over the natural gas plants in the LA area into green hydrogen. So you don't have to worry, it gives you the advantage of not having to worry about intermittent power generation as you get with wind and solar. You have a market for all of that cheap solar that you're currently giving away, and you get to create power, generate power with these power plants, which you might have to shut down, and it would be a stranded asset. So this is actually a brilliant idea, and I think that I will be watching this with great curiosity. I think it'll probably be another 5 or 6 years, maybe it's 2025, if I remember correctly, that they were going to have, they were going to make serious progress on this. But I would guess that you will see other jurisdictions that have a lot of solar or wind capacity, the resource will work on this strategy as well. I think that it's the only thing lacking from making this economic right now on the green side is the electrolyzers, and the cost of those is coming down significantly. The last estimate I saw is that they'll be economic, price parity with blue hydrogen, probably in the late 20s. And if they keep making progress, maybe we'll see them by 2025 or 2027. So, and in terms of big mega projects, that may as well be tomorrow. It's very soon. So that's what Alberta and California are doing. BC also has hydrogen ambitions, because it has a lot of hydropower, and it wants to make green hydrogen and ship it over to Japan or ship it over to Asia. It looks like there's a lot of interest there. They also want to make green LNG, which is basically liquefied natural gas, and they want to use their clean power grid to electrify the liquefaction plants. So there's very little emissions associated with creating that LNG. Then the theory is you ship it over to someplace like China, and they burn it instead of coal, and you help them decarbonize. So even in a place like BC, they're also looking at hydrogen, and I can't remember whether they're looking at blue hydrogen, because BC is the second biggest natural gas producer, and next to Alberta, make about half what Alberta does. So they would have lots of natural gas if they wanted. They could do blue hydrogen as well. Then we get to Texas, which doesn't seem to have any of these plants. It's bumbling along, and it does not have a strong, robust policy for decarbonization, and is relying instead on the market. And the good news is that solar is taking off in Texas, and at some point may displace natural gas, displace that coal. But we'll have to wait and see. It's not clear what's going to happen there. Of course, you know, this February they had the big blizzard, and with the outages and all of the, you know, was a disaster that accompanied that. So we'll see what Texas comes up with, because they could, in theory, copy Alberta around, at least around its hydrogen and renewables strategy. All of that would, to my way of thinking, would make perfect sense down in Texas. But you can see that each jurisdiction, given their history, given the resources they have, given their approach to, you know, politics and culture and business and so on, everybody's taking a different approach to this. Everybody has a different model, a different decarbonization pathway. And if you can then take that and apply that to all 10 provinces in Canada and the other 48 states in the US. And so it's hard to generalize here because of that variety in how oil and gas and coal are going to be, where they're going to fit on these various decarbonization pathways. So Ian, if you could change the, so to wrap up, and again, this is my take on it. Not everybody agrees with this, but this is my take. I think coal has absolutely no long-term future. I think that the world wants to get off coal as quickly as possible, and you saw some of that in COP26. You know, with they instead of a phase out, they talked about a phase down in the final text in the final declaration. Fair enough. We'll see what COP27 brings. There might be more pressure and more politics, diplomacy have done, and maybe they'll get to phase out. But I think it's pretty clear that even China and India are looking to get off coal, you know, by maybe 2060, 2070. Crude oil, we will see. I think as a feedstock for fuel, for transportation, electricity is the first time in 125 years that petroleum has had a competitor in transportation, and that's electricity. And the thing you need to know here is that electric vehicles within, now again, I just talked to, it was this Bloomberg NEF analyst, and he said that by 2023 or 2024, the big electric vehicles, the luxury ones, will reach price parity with their internal combustion engine equivalent, because there's more profit in those, and so they can bring the price. It's easier for them to bring the price down. On the smaller vehicles, it'll probably arrive around 2026 or 2027. And the reason for that is the drop in battery prices. So batteries in 2020 cost $137 a kilowatt hour. In the many batteries, that's the average, because many manufacturers are already at $100 a kilowatt hour, which is kind of the threshold for price parity. But the average by 2024 will drop to 80. By the late 2020s, it'll be 60. And in the early 2030s, it will be around 45 to 50, but $48 is what they think. And at the same time, energy density is rising an average of 7% per year. So if you give it a decade, and now you've got 70% more electricity in a battery, your range goes up 70%. And at the same time, your cost has gone from 137 down to 48 on your battery. You can see that not only will electric vehicles be cheaper to buy, but they'll have range, you know, maybe they'll have a 700-800 kilometer range. maybe a 500-mile range. Where they're talking now about 1,000-mile range, and you'll be able to charge them really quickly because they'll be solid states, and so they'll essentially be a replacement for an internal combustion. That's happening this decade, and the adoption curve that Bloomberg NEF has got is just very steep. It just right about now is starting to take off. And between now and 2030, the curve becomes very steep. So I think that oil's future. The trend is very clear. The only question will be timing, and we probably will have a small amount of oil consumption, that 25 million to 50 million barrels a day, declining after 2050, but that could stretch out to 2075, 20, whatever, when we get down to smaller. Even smaller amounts. And natural gas will be around for a long time, and as a feedstock for plastics and hydrogen, as well as prized for its lower carbon intensity. So to sum all of that up, coal has no future, oil has some future, and natural gas has the most future in a low carbon economy. And whether it does in your country or your state or province where you live depends on the decarbonization pathways that your government and your industry and so on choose. And so with that, I'll kind of wrap that up and turn it over to Ian.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. I mean, there's so many questions that really bubble up to the surface, and we'll take audience questions here, but some top of mind ones are how to bring this to students in K-12 classrooms. I think more so this is going to be material that's most accessible for secondary and post-secondary students. So, K-8, probably a lot less so. Right off the bat, I imagine, doing case studies, having classes, going to groups and do presentations about, what's happening in BC, what's happening in Texas, like what are all these different paths to decarbonization? And then applying that to your home jurisdiction. So if you have, if you're a school in Virginia or you're a school in Quebec, look at the case studies from other areas, make a Venn diagram, look at, okay, what are things that could apply here? What are things that don't apply here? What's the line of best fit? And, that brings a lot of very useful aspects of effective education, like project-based learning, problem-based learning, collaboration. You can generate lots of discussion. You can create solutions, like all kinds of very useful stuff. Do you have any additional suggestions on how to bring this to students? Because it's such rich material.
Not being a teacher, I'm loath to go too far down this road because I'll step in a landmine. But I like your idea of case studies, because there's a tremendous amount of information that's accessible over the internet. Our Energy Student Resources portal, we have interviews and articles, and we'll be putting together some learning modules for secondary and post-secondary. So the case study idea really would appeal to me because it'd be digestible. It's something that students could wrap their heads around, as opposed to doing an entire country or something like that. So my two bits for what it's worth. Yeah.
And it almost seems like it would be essential to do that, because you've spoken to many, many people whose livelihoods depend on oil, gas, and coal. And, it is hard to blame someone for being a bit resistant to change. As we all know, fossil fuels have been prosperous for a lot of people. You and I have talked a lot about the Newfoundland example, and when the cod fishery collapsed, a lot of people in Newfoundland worked in the oil sands in Alberta, and that allowed, families to stay together and people to stay on their feet. And like, in and of themselves, those are, very, very important things. So of course, it's very difficult to say, all right, this industry that's done, so much economic good for your family and your livelihood and allowed you to have a good, secure life is disappearing. But it isn't an end game, as the examples that you've talked about tonight illustrate. And we really do have to make up for lost time in getting this content into classrooms, because I think a lot of people maybe who work in the fossil fuel industry, they just think phase out, I'm going to lose my livelihood. And it's like, well, phase over is maybe the way that we need to characterize it. Transition. And I know there's a role for government in retraining, and that's location to location. In your discussions with folks in this industry, in the fossil fuel industry, who are resistant to change, one of the tougher nuts to crack is finding a productive, compassionate way to talk to folks who have good reason to be resistant. Have you found any techniques just in those initial discussions that perhaps teachers could use if, say they're at a parent-teacher meeting and a parent says, look, I'm not comfortable with you teaching this because this is the industry that I work in. Any words of wisdom in that regard?
That's a really tough one because a lot of the conversations that I have are in Alberta, where this is a supercharged issue.
Yeah.
And you quickly, the Hackles come up because for the very reason and there was a pollster in Calgary named Janet Brown, and she did some work on this a couple of years ago, and I interviewed her, and she said, Albertans identify with the industry.
Yeah.
They identify with oil and gas. So when you talk about phasing out oil and gas is going to decline over time, it's like they feel attacked because they identify so strongly with that industry. And that makes it difficult. But I will say now that, like, I've been reporting on the energy transition for years now. The conversations are a lot easier to have today than they were 2 years ago or 4 years ago or 6 years ago, because now the transition is just obvious. I mean, you can't deny it. And really the question is, how fast is it going to arrive? What will be the implications? It's easy to you hear politicians all the time say, "Oh, don't worry about it. The International Energy Agency says that by 2050 there'll be, we'll still need oil. So there's lots of demand. Don't worry about it." And of course, what they're doing is, they're rationalizing not having to act today because those are very difficult conversations. So I think that I guess, Ian, just from my personal experience, is first of all, the conversation has to be around, the acceptance of the energy transition. It's happening. It's driven by markets. It's driven by technology. It's not just because too many people think it's policy, right? It's all driven by climate policy. And if it's policy, well, then that's policy is the child of government. And if you have the right politics, you can form government, take over government, and change the policy. Yeah. So, the first thing is they need to understand that the energy transition is inevitable. We're 20, 30 years into it, and once it started, it gets to this point, it's not going to stop. And the other thing is, of course, the imperative of the climate crisis. And British Columbia, we heat dome this summer where we had 500 and some people die, and then now the latest the storm, the big atmospheric river storms, and another one coming this week on the North Coast. And so we're beginning to see the effect of climate change. So if ever there was a time to talk to parents who might be resistant, now would be the time. And once they're resistant, once there's even a crack in the doors open a crack, then you can walk through it with some of these arguments, some of this information and evidence, and it makes the conversation a lot easier.
Yeah, and Kathy's just shared a really useful resource there, and we'll get to Beth's great question there in a moment. In my personal experience, I've also found just like very honestly and earnestly saying, look, I know this kind of sucks. This industry's been really good for your family, and nobody's dancing on anyone's grave, so to speak. It's a kind of showing a reluctance to the inevitability of the change, because I know people who've worked in that industry and it's been really good for them, and I'm not happy that friends of mine are going to be on more unstable work ground, and even just maybe leading with that kind of example can sort of their back comes down a bit, and you can maybe find some common ground, and it's like, yeah, that this is hard, like it's not, nothing's black or white. It's not as though the oil industry is 100%, like the devil, as some people on social media would lead you to believe. And this is just, as Sydney's written in, acknowledging their feelings. Like, how is this making you feel? Like, I get that this is really crappy, and what can we do to kind of work together to help this? And that seems to be a pathway that's more productive, and we're learning more about it. Beth's question. So I guess this goes back to the overarching question. Despite the fact that we're transitioning, is it going to be enough to get to our Paris targets, which ideally are 1.5 degrees? Pretty unlikely at this point. 2 degrees may be likely, but still far from a sure thing. Is this going to happen quick enough to reach those targets?
Well, there was some disagreement about that during the COP26. I forget who did the analysis, but one group came out and said, well, we're now at 1.8. And then others disagreed and said, no, where this is 2.4 or 2.8. So there's still, and then governments still have to follow through. And that's a problem because they haven't followed through in a lot of their promises. So that's the bad news. The good news, there's two pieces of good news here, broadly speaking. One is, I think governments are, their intent, their commitment is increasing. And we saw India come with net zero by 2070, or China is now carbon neutrality by 2060 and talking about toughening that up. So governments are slowly getting there. We've got different administration in the White House that's more committed to this than the previous one was. That's a big step forward. But if there's any real hope, it's the second piece, and that is the pace at which technology is changing. It's amazing how quickly things are turning around. And just getting back to the electric vehicle industry, last year alone, the industry invested $240 billion in switching over to electric vehicles. And that is all that, what that does is that it becomes cumulative. It's the snowball rolling down the hill now. And so now, when we were pushing it up the hill, it was pretty easy to talk about pace of the transition. But now many of these technologies have hit their peak and they're rolling down the hill and they're gathering momentum. And I think the general observation around renewables, wind and solar and batteries and electric vehicles, and now we're seeing, building electrification like heat pumps and smart homes, that sort of thing. They're picking up, and the issue will be what happens not in the developed countries, because the U.S. will catch up. I think it will spend the money it needs to. And the reason the U.S. will catch up is because it twigged finally to the fact that there's economic opportunity in the energy transition. That's the big thing. And now all of a sudden, money's on board, capital's on board, the politicians are on board, and they're darn well not going to get beat out by China, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
For Canada, and then Canada will tag along with the U.S. as it gets, it invests in these new industries, and opportunities arise for Canadians because we're kind of joined at the hip, and same with Mexico to some extent. So that all of that's good. The question is, what happens to the second tier countries, the India, the South Asian countries like Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia? What happens to Brazil, Chile? Those kind of countries that in Africa, what happens there? And I did an interview with the U.S. Energy Association about the project they had in it was Uganda. No, sorry, it was Nigeria. And the infrastructure is old. They don't have a lot of money to invest in it. There's all sorts of issues around the government's role and private capital's role and so on. So how the developed countries assist those countries will make a big difference, and that's where emissions are going to be growing. That's the problem. It's not Europe is going to be decarbonizing. The U.S. and Canada are committed to doing that. That's great. But what about those other countries where emissions are going to grow, and even India? So we're not out of the woods by any stretch, but I think there's grounds for cautious optimism. And I wish I could be more optimistic than that, but I think that's about as good as it gets.
There's no use in looking at the future through rose-colored glasses if they're only slightly tinted pink. That might be the best we can do. Mike's got a good question about being based in Manitoba, where the majority of energy production is from hydro, and ways on engaging students in that kind of environment where, you know, you're not in a fossil fuel rich zone.
Well, Mike, nice to meet you. I grew up in Manitoba. In fact, my dad worked for Manitoba Hydro. He was the maintenance supervisor at the Kettle Rapids Dam up in the Nelson River. And when I was in high school, I worked summers for Hydro, and then a year after high school, which convinced me that I needed to go to university and not do that anymore. And funny story about me getting electrocuted in the middle of the night that I'll tell you someday. But the question is, you've never experienced anything until you've experienced 550 volts shooting up your arm. Good thing I was 18. But that is, I guess there's a couple of ways of approaching that, but the way I would approach it is opportunity. I mean, Manitoba Hydro is a huge player in the Manitoba economy. It now is in a position where it produces a product that is going to be in high demand. There's a lot of talk, well, not as much talk as is needed, but the federal government is committed to creating a pan-Canadian grid council to coordinate more east-west trade in electricity, more interties, and in the west, where you've got BC, you've got two hydro producing provinces, BC and Manitoba, that bookend Saskatchewan and Alberta, that have the renewable resources, especially wind, and to tie them all together, and where the hydro then can act as big batteries for the renewables, is very efficient and could enable a big expansion of Manitoba Hydro. And then, of course, Manitoba Hydro could take an approach similar to what BC is doing and getting into hydrogen, because you're right across from Minnesota, and there's no doubt there'll be opportunities there. They'll be looking for hydrogen. So, and it's been a long time since I lived in Manitoba, but I still have a brother there and still have friends there. And everybody's looking for jobs, and everybody's looking for economic opportunities. So I would think that that might be the way to engage students is, okay, you're going to graduate. What are you going to do? Well, here's an opportunity. And here's another thing. I often ask entrepreneurs or researchers, scientists, have you got opportunities for students when they graduate? Like if you had somebody with a bachelor's degree in science wanted to become a technician or a lab tech, something like that, and they can't get enough of them. And they're for people who are looking, interested in the sciences, interested in the more technical fields. That's what the expansion of these technologies. It opens up huge opportunities for employment. And so if I was a young, if I was in grade 11, 10, 11, 12, and looking forward to my future, and I had any kind of technical aptitude and was maybe good at math or science, something like that, that's where there's a lot of opportunity there. And I would think that would be a good way to engage students. I don't know, Mike, does that answer your question?
Gives me some ideas for Ontario as well.
Absolutely it does. Yes, thank you.
Where are you located, Mike?
I actually work at the Manitoba Museum in Winnipeg.
Oh, okay. I remember there is in a grade 6 trip from Thompson. Remember it well.
Nice.
Mark, just to build on that, we could spend a lot of time here. There's some other things we probably need to do, but is Manitoba Hydro kind of the same as BC? Electricity demand is going to go up because of electrification of vehicles, no more opportunity to build dams. So again, that that ability to act as a storage is going to play big in Manitoba, same as BC?
To a lesser extent, Kathy, because
Okay.
Manitoba's population is only 1/5 the size of BC, so it'll have
Okay.
it won't need as much of its own power for electrification. And I can't say this with absolute certainty, but I seem to recall that they still have capacity on the Nelson River to build more dams if they want to. So I think there's some opportunity to expand that. I'm just not sure how.
Great. Well, I don't want to keep anyone too much longer, but we do have some resource sharing to do. I'll do all the Green Teacher resource sharing just in the follow-up email, which will go out by the end of the week. But Kathy, do you have anything that you would like to share from the ACE corner of things? Oh, we're still on mute.
Yep. I'll just put the link to our resource hub in here. And again, it's just, you can search by teaching resources, by grade, by subject, by topic. So if you're looking for something specifically on different energy topics or climate change or energy efficiency. And the other piece I'll just put in the chat here and share with you guys too, is if you are a school that's trying to do some kind of those action projects with your students, we're a partner with Eco Schools Canada, where you can track your projects and get certification levels. So I'll share those two resources. But I think, Sydney, you have more specific resources on these topics. So I'll turn it over to you and I'll just put the links in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, I do have some resources. So, hey everyone, I'm from Green Learning. So we do have some free resources in some of our programs that are really relevant to the conversations we've been having today. The first one I want to show you here is our re-energy program. So this is all about renewable energy and renewable energy technologies. Specifically, I want to show you one of our last modules, and we have quite a few here. But someone was mentioning in the chat just about hydroelectricity and learning about hydroelectricity. We also have an entire unit on energy storage, which is very relevant across a number of different themes and topics when it comes to energy transition and electrification. So you can definitely check out all of these resources. We do have a renewable energy challenge where students can build any type of renewable energy technology from storage batteries to hydroelectric generators to solar ovens, and they can be entered in to win some really awesome prizes. I did earlier drop this link in the chat to switch to renewables.ca. And so this site has some really fantastic visuals of electricity generation, and you can look up by province. It is for Canada specifically, but some really great things that can be used to compare different provinces, look at Canada as a whole. So a really rich resource there as well. The last thing I want to just quickly highlight is that we do also have a Decoding Carbon program. So this is all about climate policy, and specifically, I want to highlight one backgrounder that we have. So this is called Climate Policy Options, and it is in the activity called Climate Policy Options, and it does take you through different types of ways that policy can be used to address fossil fuels and carbon taxes and carbon pricing. And it really breaks it down into really understandable terms for students. And these backgrounders are used by teachers to help them understand the topic, but can also be passed off right on to students. So if you're looking for a really easy student-friendly resource to learn about these systems and these policies that are available and explore things like cap and trade, I would highly recommend this backgrounder and that activity specifically, but there are a number of great activities in the program as well. I'm also just going to drop my email in the chat here, so feel free to reach out anytime if you have any questions about our resources or are looking for something specifically. We have lots of stuff to offer, so I can definitely help you out with finding that. But it was really great to be part of this series. Thank you so much, Markham. I know I learned so much going through this entire series and have had some really great conversations in my personal and professional life just about these topics and these themes. So it's been really beneficial for me to be part of this. But I will pass it back over to Ian to wrap us up.
That's great. And, Sydney really summed this up. This has been such an informative and enriching series. And we really thank Markham for his great insights and his ongoing work that he's doing now a bit more into school and educational outreach, and just his daily work as a climate and energy journalist. And again, I encourage you to subscribe to the Energy Media YouTube channel. You can do so for free, and you'll learn a lot. You'll meet through those videos and those interviews some very influential people, largely Canada, US, but not entirely Canada, US, who know about stuff that we all need to know more about, to put it quite simply. So thank you, Mike and Beth, for joining us for the live session. Thank you for everyone who's going to be tuning into the recording, which will be posted on the Green Teacher website by the end of the week. And I will also send a follow-up email that includes the link to the feedback survey, which I also threw in the chat box, list of all of the resources that have been mentioned, and again, the link to the recording. So thank you, Markham.
Well, thank you, Ian, for the invitation. I really enjoyed this, and thanks everybody for attending, and to Kathy and to Sydney as well.
All right, we will leave it there. We hope to see everyone again soon. Reach out anytime if you have questions, and be well.